Good evening. Thanks, brother, for the water. You read my mind. Okay, well, last year, if you remember, or if you're with us then, we spent two different quarters, the fall quarter of 2014 and the winter quarter, talking about apologetics or Christian evidences. As I said then, this material is based largely on the material that Apologetics Press puts out. And during those two quarters, we made it basically two-thirds of the way through. And I have been wanting to get the rest of that curriculum done, and this quarter provided another opportunity, so we're going to try to work through the rest of it. I heard from many people that they really liked the discussion of apologetics and Christian evidences, so hopefully that will continue as we move forward. The topics this quarter are going to be, I don't want to say more detailed, because if you remember the ones we did earlier, they were very detailed and seemed like science lessons half the time, with all the tricky words and everything else that kept tying up my tongue. But this quarter we are going to be getting into more depth on some of the basic topics that we talked about earlier in the year. But before we get started on that, the first half of tonight, I actually want to kind of do a little review. So, we've all slept since we've covered this material last, so if you're like me, you need to kind of have it refreshed in your memory before we start building on it. And first off, just want to refresh our memories as to what apologetics is. It comes from a Greek word that actually just means speaking in defense. Some have said that it is, how does that word apology fit in there, that root word? But it's really just the discipline of defending a position, often religious, through the systematic use of information. Early Christian writers who defended their faith against critics and actually recommended their faith to outsiders were called apologists. When we started this class or this curriculum last fall, we opened up talking about the many faces of unbelief. And why do so many obviously intelligent people prefer to believe that there is no God? I imagine each one of us could come up with different answers for that. Humanity and Americans in general, or specifically, we pride ourselves on freedom and freedom of choice. And I'm not necessarily referring to the freedom of choice that is popular in the media, how they refer to it in regards to abortion, but just our freedom to choose how to live our lives. Human beings are free moral agents. We have been given the right to make our own decisions. Each person decides what they want to wear. Some have questioned my purple shirt, but we have the right to choose what to wear, what we want to eat, where we want to go, how we want to spend our time. But most important, each person decides what he or she wants to believe. But with that freedom comes a word that's has a negative connotation now, and that is responsibility. With that freedom comes responsibility. It comes with the responsibility to think carefully about our decisions, to choose wisely, and to even act forcefully. And because of that, it's the responsibility of every human being to recognize, believe, and obey the truth. So we talked about some major categories of the faces of unbelief, one of which we're very familiar with is atheists. And the word atheism simply means without God. The atheist is the person who says that there is no God. That's how they put it. An atheist who is one who just flat out will tell you God does not exist. Then we have agnostics, and the word agnostic means without knowledge. The agnostic doesn't boldly just come out and say there is no God. Instead, the agnostic will say, well, we don't know. We can't know whether God really exists because there's just not enough information. There's not enough proof, not enough evidence to base that conclusion. In essence, then, they're just saying, I don't know, you don't know, nobody knows, and so forth. Therefore, who can know if there really is a God? Then we have the skeptic, and that's pretty straightforward is what that is. A skeptic is a person who just doubts that there is a God. They don't claim that the knowledge about or of God is unattainable, as the agnostic does, but rather they're just uncertain about it. The skeptic is not prepared to accept anything except that which can be verified empirically using the five senses. And we talked about the infidel. And we all know that since the events of September 11th, we've become very familiar with that word. But the infidel is the person who not only refuses to believe in God himself, but they are also intolerant of those who actually do believe, or anybody who opposes them. The infidel will actively speak out against God, and they'll do all they can to condemn anyone who disagrees with them. The infidel despises God and the Bible, and anyone who believes in either one of them. We also talked about some of the reasons for the causes, if you will, of unbelief. One of which was the bias against God. There's little doubt that many people find belief in God difficult because in their mind they have a bias that sways them against it. In other words, it comes down to the fact that the will of man, the will of my will, is often in a collision course with that of God. And most of the time, I'm going to choose my will. That's just the way people are. Another cause of unbelief is the influence of parents on upbringing. Generally speaking, mothers and fathers not only are the first influences in a child's life, but they are a continuing influence. On occasion, however, parents fail to teach their children to believe in God. And sadly, sometimes they even teach a child not to believe. Another cause of unbelief is education. We talked about this extensively during previous quarters. And it's one of the biggest reasons that exist for unbelief. And that is just quite simply improper education. Proper education, it's a wonderful tool that can be used to do all kinds of things, build better communities and nations, but there are types of education that are harmful. They're bad. not only for the individuals, but for societies as well. And any education system that tries to destroy belief in a divine creator or God, quite simply, it's a negative education that can only lead to ruin. And sadly, that is what is being perpetuated in most of our public education systems now. Immorality is another cause of unbelief. Quite simply, many people choose not to believe in God because if they do, then they will have to change the way they live, change their behavior. As soon as they admit that there is a God, then they have to admit that God wants them to do and live a certain way. Most of these people, they do not want a God who tells them what to do. So they simply choose not to believe, or to believe there is no God. Another cause of unbelief is scientific materialism. We're living in a time when science is seen as the end-all, be-all of everything. It rules. And we can observe its accomplishments every day. Science has been successful in doing many, many wonderful things. But we need to be sure to acknowledge that all that science owes to God. But one of the greatest obstacles to belief in God is the attitude that somehow science has made God obsolete. And many scientists today claim that the only way to discover something is by empirical observation, using your five senses. If something cannot be observed in that way, using the five senses, then it either doesn't exist or it's not very important. And of course, since God cannot be observed using these five senses, too many scientists they believe that he doesn't exist or that he's not very important even if he does. And following along with that, another cause of unbelief is intellectual peer pressure. And this follows right up with with science in general. Scientists they rely heavily on peer review. Doctors, they do it. Researchers, scientists, they need that positive reinforcement from their peers. Nobody, whether they're a scientist or just any of us, want to be considered, or we don't want to be labeled as stupid, dumb, ignorant, or moronic. But all of those titles, labels, if you will, have been applied to people who are willing to defend the existence of God and the biblical concept of creation. And it's not just labels, but there's actual real persecution that goes on in some of these situations. If you've been reading the headlines recently, and for those of you that don't know me well, I work in the weather field, and I frequently go back to the discussion about climate change and global warming. But there are actually people now that want to prosecute you if you disagree with man-made global warming. So it's not just a label of them calling you an idiot. They actually want to put you away for it. And that intellectual peer pressure does cause some people to just, okay, I don't believe there's a God. Just leave me alone. Don't come after me. And all the time now we hear this term, bullying is a big thing now. It's in the headlines a lot. But that's in effect what this is. They're trying to bully people into buying into what they're selling. Thousands of highly intelligent people are scientists, and many of them believe in evolution. I mean, that's the only answer. The idea being suggested then is that because thousands of intellectual scientists believe in it, that then all intelligent people must believe in evolution. And only hayseeds would believe in God. I mean, after all, how could so many smart people be wrong? I've seen this firsthand. It really happens. The final cause for unbelief that we talked about last fall was evil, the existence of evil in the world, the existence of pain, and suffering. And this just simply comes from the idea that these people develop in their minds that if there is an all-knowing, all-powerful, loving God, and if He is all good, then why do bad things happen to good people or innocent victims, such as babies? Many people have abandoned their belief in God because of the presence of suffering in their lives or in the lives of those close to them. After laying the foundation there of the causes of unbelief and the faces of unbelief, we then moved pretty quickly through the existence of God, talking about the law of cause and effect, and just briefly review that again. The law of cause and effect and the cosmological argument based upon that law have implications in every area of human life. The universe is here. None of us will deny that. And therefore, based on the law of cause and effect, it must have an adequate antecedent cause. And simply put, the central message of the cosmological argument is that the law of cause and effect upon which it is based is this: every material effect must have an adequate cause that came before it. The universe is here. Intelligent life is here. Morality is here. Ethics is here. Love is here. What is their adequate antecedent cause? Since the effect never can come before or be greater than the cause, then it stands to reason that the cause of life must be a living intelligence that itself is moral, ethical, and loving. When the Bible records, "In the beginning, God," it makes known to us and everyone who reads it such a first cause. Then we talked about the existence of God with focusing mainly on the design. The only people who have difficulty understanding the implications of design are those that have they refuse to have God in their knowledge. Some people can say that there is no designer, but their arguments are far from convincing. I mean, think about it in simple terms. One doesn't get a poem without a poet, or a law without a lawgiver. One doesn't get a painting without a painter, or a musical score without a composer. And just as surely, one doesn't get purposeful design without a designer. The design in the universe, and we went into great detail in that, from the giant universe itself to the tiny cells in our body, it's apparent, and it is sufficient to draw the conclusion demanded by the law of rationality, and that is that God does exist. We then spent a couple of weeks talking about creationism versus evolution, and we'll get back into that in future weeks. But basically, there are two very different and totally opposite explanations for the origin of the universe and the origin of life within the universe. Each of these explanations, it's an entire worldview or philosophy of origins and destinies of life and meaning. One of these views is that of, it's the concept of evolution. And according to the theory of evolution, the universe is self-contained, which means that everything in the universe has come into being through random processes without any kind of supernatural involvement. This view says that the origin and development of the universe and all the life in it can be explained simply by time, by chance, and the continuing natural processes. According to evolutionary theory, all living things have arisen from a single cell organism, which in turn had arisen from something non-living, such as an amino acid or a protein. The second worldview is the concept of creation. And according to the theory of creation, as we will refer to it here, the universe is not self-contained. Everything in the universe has come into being through a design, through a purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator who, using processes that are continuing today, created the universe, the earth, and all the life on earth. And that includes all the basic types of plants and animals, as well as humans. There are two, and only two, possibilities concerning origins. One or the other of them must be true, and one of them is false. And that is to say that all things either can or cannot be explained in terms of an ongoing natural process in a self-contained universe. And that's where I'll cut off the review for tonight. And now I want to talk more and get a little more in depth into what we started off with unbelief. The modern world increasingly is one of unbelief. Not just when we think of God, but people seem to be more, skeptical. They don't want to believe in anything except themselves far too often. Faith in God is clearly under assault. I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And because of that, the time is here, and it is now for responsible people to fortify their minds and those of our children, those we are in contact with the kind of evidence that can weather the attacks of unbelief. And that's why I like doing this talk and why I think it's important. I think we all need to we need to have the tools, if you will, to be able to defend our belief. There is nothing new about infidelity. More than 3,000 years ago, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, in response to Moses' challenge to the people of Israel, be freed, said, "Who is Jehovah, that I should hearken unto his voice to let Israel go? I know not Jehovah." That's Exodus chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. There are numerous deluded souls who proudly boast of being spiritual descendants of that ancient pagan. To some, unbelief is a mark of intellectual sophistication, and they frankly contend that faith in God ought to be relegated to some kind of a superstition. Others not going to that extreme, feel that faith is, at least to a certain degree, it is just, quite frankly, unprovable. And such an assumption is incorrect. God does exist, and He hasn't asked us to gamble our eternity upon the set of non-provable assertions. The word unbelief is complex. Unbelievers come in a wide range, various varieties, if you will. We talked a little bit about the atheist who adamantly says that there is no God. The skeptic who's not quite so brazen, simply doubts the existence of a supreme being. The agnostic that argues that, I just don't know. Nobody really knows. There's not sufficient evidence. So, we just don't know. Then we have the deist, who theoretically acknowledges the existence of a supreme creator, but his God has no interest or contact with man. We didn't talk about that one last quarter, but it is a group of people that is growing in number. These people they believe in a superior being, but that they don't believe that the revelation through Scripture, they believe it's a myth. It's stuff that was put out by men. And they also believe that worship and our communicating with this supreme being in prayer or anything like that, it's meaningless. Each of these philosophies, quite frankly, it's just dead wrong, and it will lead to eternal ruin. Those who subscribe to these views for various reasons, they have, for various reasons, forced the evidence for God's existence from their minds. We need to think about it that unbelief, it's not natural. Rather, it forces reason aside to capture the mind. I mean, we as human beings have a need to believe. If God is the ground of all existence, and if He is the one in whom we live, and have He's just the reason for our every being, it is only reasonable to conclude that mankind would have a basic need to believe in Him. Studies both of the past and the present reveal that this is indeed the case. Man is curiously awed by a sense of the divine. Even the atheist, there's a need within them to want to believe in something. And in their case, they just believe that there is no God. But man has an incurable urge to believe in a higher being. But why do people turn to atheism? If atheism is not normal, why do certain people become unbelievers? First of all, it is well known that the seeds of atheism can be planted very early in life. One of the most dangerous contributions a parent can make toward the spiritual delinquency of his child is a failure to instill them with the wholesome respect for authority. If the parent neglects to set the proper example as an authority figure, or refuses to exercise discipline with love, he might be rejected as an authority figure by his child, and thus, by transference, the child ultimately may come to disdain all authority, including the supreme authority, God. I mean, I don't know how many of you have recently watched anything that's on the Disney Channel. But seems like every show that's on there portrays the children as being the smart ones, and their parents are complete idiots. And if it wasn't for the kids, there'd just be total chaos. And that is a dangerous thing. It's one of the reasons I've never let my children watch the Disney Channel, because it's just terrible, the stuff that's in there. And it gets in the child's head, and it makes them question all authority. Second, inordinate pride facilitates atheism. This disposition sees a man as his own God. Hence, he will submit to no one else. Evolutionist George Gaylord Simpson wrote that a man is his own master. He can and must decide his own destiny. Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheistic philosopher who made such an impact on Hitler, once said, "If there were gods, how could I endure it to be no God?" Mankind rejects a belief in God in order to be free of moral responsibility. I believe this is probably one of the most common ones now. In an article titled "Confessions of a Professed Atheist," Aldous Huxley argued that belief in God and viewing the world as having meaning were hindrances to sexual freedom. The French atheist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Everything is indeed permitted if God does not exist." Makes sense. The psalmist pinpointed it, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, and they have done abominable works." Fourth, sometimes people turn to atheism because their faith in someone who professes to be a devout believer has been shattered. And they see believers as being hypocrites. And yes, we could argue that just becomes an excuse for them, but nevertheless, it does turn people away. It really makes no sense, though, to blame deity for the blunders of man. Psalm 118:8. "It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man." Moving into the topic of suffering a little bit more as a reason for unbelief. With many people, the great obstacle to belief, which we talked about a few minutes ago, is the problem of evil and suffering. Because men cannot subject all suffering to meaningless analysis, the assumption sometimes is made that there just simply cannot be a loving God, such as the Bible portrays, because of all these things that are happening. The problem, as presented by the Greek philosopher Epicurus, is this: if God wishes to prevent evil, but cannot, then he is not all-powerful. If he can prevent evil, but will not, he is not good. If he has both the power and the will to eliminate evil, then why is evil in the world? The fallacy of this argument, of course, is the assumption that there is no good purpose to be served by the allowance of evil and suffering in the world. No one would be so presumptuous as to assert that man can completely understand the problem of suffering. Other than what he has revealed to us in his word, the purposes of God are unknown to man, and how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past tracing out, Romans 11:33. But enough answers are provided in the Bible to allow us to accept that inexplicable percentage on the basis of faith, trusting in the loving God who always does what is right. Even if we don't understand it, we know it's right. So we can look at a few things here. First, we should note that when one raises the question of evil, he is appealing to some universal system of justice, which evil allegedly violates. But if there is no God, hence there is no universal system of righteousness or rightness. So if that was the case, how could there be any evil? Does not the word evil suggest the violation of some standard? Yes. Actually then, so no atheist consistent with his own philosophy should even introduce the problem of evil. Second, let's consider this argument. Love allows freedom of choice. Think about it. Could anyone conceive of a loving God who created intelligent beings, but then programmed them to slavishly serve him without personal willpower? No. But we're told in 1 John 4, verse 8, God is love. Thus, God allows freedom of choice. So then consider this, that where there is freedom of choice, there is responsibility, or there is the possibility that finite beings such as ourselves will make wrong choices. Not only a possibility, but likelihood. But wrong choices can entail evil and suffering. If all choices, both good and bad, produce the same effect, how would one ever learn to choose the former and reject the latter, or even want to? So, where there is freedom of choice, there is an inevitable consequence that finite beings such as ourselves we have to be allowed to suffer the consequences of our choices. In light of this, how are we doing on time? Getting very close. We'll wrap it up here shortly. But in light of this, let us think about these several categories of suffering in the world. We frequently suffer due to our own personal wrong choices. I'm sure you can think of those in your life. Think of it as if a man steals and goes to prison. Whose fault is it? Well, many would probably argue that it was his grandfather or something. There's always kinds of different people that it's blamed on, but ultimately it's the person who did the stealing. Much suffering is a consequence of other people's freedom of choice. Do we covet freedom of choice for ourselves, yet want to deny it to others? Think of it in this way. An innocent party may be killed in a wreck involving a drunken driver. We talked, just earlier mentioned abortion. It doesn't get any more innocent than that. Sometimes we pay a price for other people's wrong choices. Suffering is frequently the result of freedom of choice that is abused by previous generations. We reap the benefits for the labors of former generations, but can we avoid reaping the evils as well? Innocent children starve in countries in the Far East because their ancestors rejected God and decided to worship cows. In connection to this point, some additional observations can be made. Consider, for example, the numerous diseases with which mankind is blighted. Ultimately, many of these are related to humanity's bad choices or sin. Before their sin, Adam and Eve were unaffected by disease and death. When they rebelled, however, they were deprived of the tree of life, and their offspring have become heir to the conditions they introduced into the world. And we are out of time now with that. So we will stop there. Next week, we're going to get into talking about origins and whether or not it's random chance or intelligent design. Thank you for your time.